Welcome to Parker Gale's very fast overview of cybersecurity. In this quick presentation, we're going to walk you through some foundational concepts, talk about some practical tools. We'll talk about industry standards for information security, explain a few detailed things about networking, just to give you a basic understanding of what you need to deal with from a cybersecurity perspective, whether you're dealing with your portfolio companies, whether you're looking at cybersecurity as a space, or you're looking at managed service providers to work with your portfolio companies. So in terms of agenda, let's just set the stage. We're going to kick things off by setting some baseline security goals. So what do most organizations aim for when it comes to quote unquote keeping their systems safe? Then we'll dive into the OSI model and networking basics, because let's face it, at the heart of cybersecurity, it's all about protecting your stuff and the wires or waves that connect it. After that, we'll take a quick tour of the different kinds of devices and servers that need safeguarding, and then we'll explore 8 broad categories of security software. Now, most of them are full-on suites at this point, and they tend to overlap from a product standpoint, but it'll give you a solid sense of the basic tools that you want to have in place for a reasonable cybersecurity program. And again, this will vary by the kind of line you business in and the nature of how you engage with customers, but it'll give you sort of a broad understanding. Toward the end, we'll zoom out a bit to look at cybersecurity standards, i.e. frameworks that you might want to design your security system around. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with a look at what kind of third-party services you might get from an MSSP or a third-party security consultant to sort of fill in the gaps for you. So at the end of the day, we're going to leave you a good handle of what to expect in everything cybersecurity. So let's talk about cybersecurity goals, just a very simple view. From a no jargon look at the core of cybersecurity, there are really just 4 big goals or strategies or focus areas to remember. First up, it's essential to ensure that the right people, that's your employees, your customers, your partners, your vendors, all have access to the systems and data that they need to perform their jobs effectively, and only that data and systems. So security is not about locking everything down and throwing away the key. It's about precision access, not full-on denial. Now, secondly, we want to keep the wrong people out, of course. This includes hackers who might try to sneak in, steal your data, block your systems with denial of service attacks, hijack your email servers to send spam to half the internet. We've all seen that happen. And that's not just external hackers, but internal people within your organization as well. Third, we want to protect the integrity of your data. So no unauthorized edits, deletions, or alterations. If your policy says we keep a year's worth of backup data, then we want to make sure that's exactly what happens. And then finally, there's the whole issue of formal compliance, because whether it's GDPR, ISO, HIPAA, or some other alphabet soup standard, your security practices often need to meet a very specific set of industry or legal standards. So really, cybersecurity is about balancing access, defense, stability, and compliance without turning your workplace into Fort Knox. We can't make it too difficult for people on a daily basis, specifically your employees, customers, partners, and vendors, to do the things they need to do with your systems and data. Now, under the covers, part of what really makes all this work together is data, files, and systems, and then connecting that stuff via the network. Because today's world, we live in all systems are really connected. So next up on the list, we're going to dive into what's commonly known as the OSI model. It's the classic layer cake of networking, and we'll look at a picture of this in a second. And just a bit of basic networking understanding in general, because it's helpful to understand how security fits into all this. Now, just a fair warning, this does get a tiny bit technical and a little bit academic, but hang in there. It can be helpful to understand where security actually fits as regards networking in the big puzzle of systems, devices, and data flying around your network. So think of it as learning the map or learning how things are connected before we dive into securing the territory. So here's the big academic slide, and we'll cover this quickly, I promise you. So little trip down memory lane. This diagram shows the OSI model, short for Open Systems Interconnection, which was introduced way back in 1984 by ISO. Yep, those same standards, people. It was brought to bring order to the networking chaos of the 70s. And if you've seen our other presentation about the history of computing, we talk a little bit about this sort of Wild West. Back then, tech giants like IBM, Xerox, DEC were all using their own totally incompatible systems and networking. So ISO and CCITT teamed up to create a neat 7-layer model that explains how data travels through a network, from physical cables and blinking lights all the way up to the apps that we use every day. In parallel, they tried to introduce an OSI protocol suite, which is a set of standards that everybody else would adopt, but that never really caught on, mostly thanks to the rise of TCP/IP and ARPANET's embracing of TCP/IP in connected systems. But the model itself stuck around as really a decent teaching tool. It gives us a common language to understand and troubleshoot networks, even if we don't use it as rigorously as we once thought we were going to use it. So let's just walk through the layers very quickly, and you'll see practical examples of this on the next slide. So this is a little bit academic, but it'll help you to sort of understand what's what. So let's walk through the layers from bottom to top. Layer 1 is the physical layer. That's your cables, your ports, Wi-Fi signals. Layer 2 is the data link layer, and this handles how data frames are formatted and transmitted over a physical link. Layer 3 is the network layer, which figures out how your data gets from point A to point B. Layer 4 is the transport layer, which decides how that data is packaged and processed for delivery from one system to the next. When we move to layer 5, that's the session layer, which keeps your conversations going. So that's managing ports like doors and windows in your system. So this keeps a constant connection, like from your browser to a server, for example, would be maintained by the session layer. Layer 6 is the presentation layer. This assures that the data makes sense. This is where things like encryption and data formatting live. And finally, layer 7, the application layer, is where most of you will end up interacting with software and applications and security software. Think web browsers, email clients, FTP clients, and more. Now, while network engineers and cybersecurity folks are often busy working down the lower layers, most users, most application developers live happily in layer 7, and we'll show some examples of that in just a second. So if we look at a practical example, and we'll go in the opposite order this time. So we'll walk from the top of the OSI model down so you can see how everything stacks up from the software that you're using all the way down to the underlying protocols. So as we mentioned before, at the very top is the application layer where all your familiar stuff lives. So think browsers talking over HTTP or HTTPS, email clients using SMTP or IMAP. So SMTP for sending, IMAP for reading email. And again, we'll talk about these in a little more detail in some subsequent slides, or even things like file transfers via FTP. These apps rely on protocols like DNS to find where they're going, and SNMT to talk to network devices. And then just beneath that, we have the presentation layer, which again, we talked about. It's all about packaging and encryption and integrity. You know, in today's world, the heavy lifting is done by TLS. I mean, even though it does still say SSL in your browser, for the most part, under the covers, we've all swapped to TLS, which is a faster, much more rigorous protocol than SSL, much more difficult to break. So this layer ensures that your traffic is secured, encrypted, and hasn't been tampered with from where it was sent from the server to where you're using it within your application. What gets sent from the originator is what you're absolutely receiving. If we move down, the session layer manages longer-term connections. Think of your mapped network drives, printers, phone calls using the old SIP protocol, good old NetBIOS if you're familiar with old file-based networks like Novell networks way back in the day. The transport layer is next, and in today's world, it's mostly about TCP and UDP, and we're going to talk about those in a little more detail in a subsequent slide here, but there were lots of different standards for this layer in the past. IBM had their own networking protocols, DEC had DECnet, but in today's world, we've really, at the transport layer, kind of the two biggest beasts here are going to be TCP and UDP. Below that comes the network layer, home to your IP, actually the IP address on the internet, and ARP, which helps devices find each other. Below that is the data link layer, where standards like Ethernet, which is kind of the dominant that people know of, or PPP, point to point. So if you have dedicated tunnels between two of your offices or two different systems, that might be over PPP, or ATM protocol, asynchronous transfer mode. This layer decides how data is actually framed and passed along. And then finally, at the bottom is the physical layer, which is literally the plugs, cables, Wi-Fi signals, standards like Bluetooth. Literally connecting your data, from one device to the other is handled at the physical layer. Again, we won't spend much time on this. You will mostly be spending your time at the application layer, but this is you're debugging a problem or finding out where a breach has occurred. Your network people, your cybersecurity specialists are going to be dropping down to deeper layers here. Just as a purposes of example, we talked about at the application layer and how lots of applications plug in at this layer, right? Sort of important to understand how the mapping is. So we're using a particular metaphor here. We're going to call this the apartment building metaphor. So at the top here, I'm showing what is on the far left, which is it would be an IP address, so 10.20.20.124. That could be mapped to the physical name of your machine, so your top level domain. So in our case, Parker Gale, we have parkergale.com, but we could have any number of machines that are mapped to a IP address, and they can be given their own name. So www.parkergale.com or ftp.parkergale.com. In this case, I'm just showing an example of just machine.domain.com. And then in our little metaphor, yeah, that's equivalent to an address. That's Oak Street. That's a server. It's a device. All your devices have an IP address. Now, at the application layer, the second piece of that is what's called the port. So I've shown a variety of standard ports. So the HTTP protocol, which most people remember is passing over port 80. So on your machine, if you have a web server that's listening on port 80, then your apartment building located at 10.20.20.124, i.e. your server, may have a piece of software running on port 80 that's listening for network traffic to come into your address on that port. So almost every application that you're going to deal with has a dedicated port to it. Now, you don't always have to use this port, but there has to be a port available to plug into. And so this is a lot of what network security software looks at is addresses of machines and what ports are open. What can you get to? And there are protocols to cross these things. So if you're running a web browser and you're getting packets of data that are coming back that are not in an HTTP format over port 80 and you've got a web server listening on it, it's going to barf. But this gives you an idea of on any given machine or server, you may have multiple software programs all listening on different ports. Now, we talked about two basic kinds of protocols here. For all practical purposes in our world, you've got TCP and UDP. TCP, which is Transmission Control Protocol, this assures that data is delivered correctly and in order. So it gets sent from one machine to the other, is following a three-way handshake that you're synchronizing, you're acknowledging the connection, you're acknowledging a packet of data sent. So it's performing the acknowledgements, it's performing retransmissions if packets are lost. It handles flow control to avoid network congestion. So it'll handle slowing things down from your server to your client and vice versa, depending on how busy the network is. And so TCP is used when data accuracy matters. So web pages, downloading a file, sending an email, these all tend to be TCP-based protocols. UDP, or User Datagram Protocol, is an alternative way to send data. In this model, you send packets without establishing a connection, almost in broadcast mode. There's no guarantee that the packets will arrive in order, or aren't duplicated. Because of this, it's much faster with very low overhead, and you tend to use it when speed is more important than reliability, like live audio, video audio streaming, online gaming, voice calls, that sort of thing. And that requires the software on either end to do a much better job. If you're sending UDP packets and they're coming out of order, then the software that's reading those packets has to deal with it, which is why you often see things like jankiness in live video and audio streaming, but it's much faster and much lower overhead. So next up on our agenda, let's talk about the real stars of your network, right? The devices and servers that end up as the endpoints for all of these things. At the end of the day here, all this fancy talk about protocols and models is just a way to make sure the hardware is doing its job. We're talking about the routers, switches, firewalls, servers, laptops, that one printer that never seems to work when you need it. These are the physical workhorses behind every connection, request, and cat video download for you internet fans. Whether it's a beefy database server in a data center or a laptop onto someone's desk, these devices are what all the network traffic that's flowing through your network is sending data to and from. And there are a broad set of categories, but we'll divide them into 5 sort of simple categories. So a very simple list of what may be in your data center or in your logical network. First is edge devices. So your iPhone, a laptop, Internet of Things devices, shop floor machinery, anything that's accessing your systems, any device that's connected to your network, is typically going to be considered an edge device, other than core networking devices. They sometimes can be thought that way as well, but we'll separate them into their own category. So network devices in our world will be routers, switches, gateways, modems, bridges, wireless access points if you're connected via Wi-Fi, network controllers. These are all the individual components that allow the wires to get connected, the internet to get connected to all your edge devices and all your computing servers in your network. Now, some of the software that runs on the edge devices also runs on the network devices. So network devices are not simply just a simpleton device. They're often very sophisticated under the covers, like your routers. Many of them are going to be running the Linux operating system or a highly customized version of Linux under the covers. They're pretty sophisticated on their own, but we can logically separate them between edge devices that your users are using or data is being stored at, and your network devices that are moving these systems around and connecting all this data. Now, you also have some specialized servers that can be kind of like an edge device. So things like a load balancer or a web server, i.e. HTTP server, or an FTP server, or an application server. So that would be plugging like a web server with an application layer like Apache Tomcat, Active Directory server. So these are typically going to be running on a native operating system like a Linux box or a Windows box, but they may be dedicated to a very specific function. So you may have a web server that's serving up web pages for your company that you're running within your data center, and it might be on a dedicated piece of hardware. Even though you could run that web server on any Linux box, on any Windows box, almost on any computer you have, you'll often provide a dedicated or specialized server for that particular function, and you will lock it down very differently. So if I have a web server that's only serving up web pages to clients or customers, is not connected to any databases, I may have that on its own machine, and the only port that's open is port 80. I may lock everything else down. So it's important to understand that you may take general purpose computers and turn them into specialized servers in some cases. Next to that is storage. And again, storage, in effect, storage is computers with storage attached to them. In the old days, you actually used to plug in your disk drives directly to your machines. That's generally not how they do things anymore. They're generally, especially for large-scale infrastructures, they are stored on separate devices. So they'd be storage-focused devices. Again, they may still be computers under the covers, but they act as a storage device. Things like network-attached storage, SANs, CDNs that you would use for content delivery. They may be dedicated to hoarding your company's precious data, all in a good way, but these would be plugged into your network, potentially plugged into your servers on your network. But you'll be running security software on these things as well. And then last but not least, we have the classic general purpose servers, whether it's a Windows, a Linux server, a laptop. Again, these are also edge devices, or you may have an IBM I or IBM z/OS mainframe, big brains powering the back of your computing infrastructure. At the end of the day, you could argue that these are just edge devices as well, but since they're living mostly in the core, we're just going to categorize them slightly differently. Now, putting this all together, behold, this is a not to scale, somewhat loosely accurate network diagram. Now, this isn't meant to be a blueprint for building your next data center. It's just more of a helpful sketch to give you the idea or the vibe of how all these devices, servers, edge devices, firewalls, load balances, how they connect and talk to each other. Now, while we might call something an edge device, in reality, as I mentioned before, it could be buried pretty deep inside your network, depending on how things are set up. And trust us, networks love to keep things interesting. There are cases where firewalls are talking to other firewalls, firewalls talking to load balancers, and everything is routed, the traffic is all routed in a unique dance choreographed to your organization's specific needs. What systems need to connect to what other systems, what users need to get access to what kinds of data. Whether you're managing a small office, a global enterprise, or something in between, you'll almost always end up with a unique mix of gear. Some remote, some local, all playing a part in keeping this digital world spinning. So don't stress about the layout. Just know that these are likely to be the puzzle pieces that you'll have to deal with from a security perspective. Now, we've talked about the goals of your cybersecurity program. We talked about what the networking model looks like and the components. We talked about devices and servers. Now let's talk about security software, right? Now, when we talk about security software, fair warning, a lot of these categories morph and they like to overlap. So don't worry about understanding or drawing hard lines. We've sort of just broken them into a series of categories that will make sense in terms of the general market share. Security specialists may look at this thing with a slightly different eye on it, but from our layman's perspective, this is close enough. If we start to talk about security software, the categories overlap, but don't worry about these hard lines. So first up, we're talking about endpoint security, which is all about protecting those edge devices we mentioned earlier. Laptops, desktops, mobile phones, even some servers. Yeah, back in the day, everybody understood antivirus was the king of endpoint security. So think, McAfee, Symantec, Windows Defender, Kaspersky, software that would scan your files and shout virus if something looks sketchy. If you fast forward today, things have leveled up. So there's, what we call EDR, or endpoint detection and response. EDR is like the device's cyber bodyguard, right? It's looking for shady behavior 24/7. It detects threats like weird logins, suspicious processes running on your machine. It can automatically respond by quarantining a device or killing bad processes. It can log everything, so your security team can hit replay on an incident like they were playing a DVR or TiVo. It helps with threat hunting, like looking for trouble before alarm bells even go off. It's very common tools: CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Carbon Black, lots of heavy hitters here. We particularly don't care which one you use, whatever makes sense for your organization. Now, if your team or clients are using a lot of mobile devices, i.e. the BYOD crowd, you might want a mobile device management solution too. And again, some of these get rolled in together into a single platform. So things like Microsoft Intune, Jamf, or VMware Workspace ONE will help you to lock, wipe, encrypt, and manage mobile endpoints. Especially because these phones, these devices are pretty powerful and they are essentially a computer in your pocket. Now, some of the EDR tools have MDM features and vice versa, but in a modern organization, you're probably going to have both to keep your endpoints in check and your security posture relatively strong. Next up are the network security tools. So think of this as the digital fence around your house, even though it's not just around your house, it's inside the network as well. So, it's the digital fence, it's laser sensors, it's your guard dogs. Most people think of network security as perimeter defense, and that's a very good starting point from a metaphor standpoint. At the highest level, you might have firewalls or bouncers or a CDN at the outside. They decide what gets in, who stays out, and what kind of traffic is allowed to pass through, whether it's HTTP, FTP, SMTP, IMAP, something custom for a particular product you're running. These can get pretty fancy, and enterprise grade gear from vendors like Palo Alto, Fortinet, Cisco ASA. Even your home laptop or Mac has a built-in firewall, like a do-it-yourself version. So really, really common. In a more complex setup, you'll also find intrusion detection and prevention systems sniffing around for anything suspicious. So you might have agents running on your edge devices and a core system, running on a network security box. They're going to be sniffing around for anything suspicious, looking for uninvited traffic creeping into your network, or looking for processes trying to exfiltrate data. Tools like Snort, Suricata, Cisco Firepower, they play detective here. So they're going to be snooping at the network traffic itself as it passes over the lines. And then last but not least, there's network access control. So think of it as the guest list for your network. So NAC is about where you're connecting from and whether your device is allowed on the network at all. So things like Aruba ClearPass or Cisco ISE let you define which users, which devices can talk to which parts of the network. So just to be clear, this isn't about controlling access to individual apps or files. It's actually controlling who can even get near the door, right? So altogether, these tools form your network's digital moat, their watchtower, their front gate, whatever metaphor kind of makes sense to you. Put our focus on the cloud for a second, or cloud security. A lot of the tools that you use to secure a traditional data center, like firewalls, routers, and switches, all still apply here. But in cloud land, they might be virtual, they might be vendor controlled. So for example, if you're running your own data center, you might be using Cloudflare as a web application firewall, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you're using AWS, they have their own, and you may choose to use that. Sometimes you're using the same exact security tools you would use in your own data center. They're just in a new setting. You're running them in an EC2 instance in AWS, for example. Other times you're dealing with tools that were specifically built for the cloud. So For example, one category is cloud security posture management. So this is a fancy way of saying tools that catch cloud misconfigurations before the bad guys do. Think Wiz or Prisma Cloud or Orca Security. And yes, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud all have their own flavors of built-in scanning. Right? These tools poke around your cloud setup looking for things like wide open storage buckets or ports that are open or overly generous permissions. While your standard cloud product like AWS or Google Cloud or Azure can be made secure and tend to be secure by default, in your own servers instances, you can open them up and you can open yourself up to some challenges. Now, they're not going to get beyond you to other AWS customers, but these tools are specifically looking for misconfigurations in the cloud environment because you would set the cloud up differently than you might set things up in your own data center, for example. Now, there are also cloud native protection tools like Trend Micro or Microsoft Defender for Cloud. They're designed to speak cloud fluently and secure the virtual tour. So they understand the cloud environment. They understand you might be on virtual or shared machines more than might be in your standard, your own data center, which is why they're their own category, if you will. And then if you need to lock things down even tighter, you can use tools like Netscope or McAfee mVision or Microsoft Defender, which can control and restrict access to all cloud resources. Now, a lot of these tools started out life as traditional security suites and have moved over into the cloud area. But it's important to treat cloud security as its own special category. You should have specialists that understand the cloud and cloud security if you are deploying stuff in the cloud. Now, the Detective Bureau of Cybersecurity, also known as Security Information and Event Management, or SIEM for short, these systems specialize in collecting and analyzing the mountains of logs that are generated by nearly every app, every tool, every security piece of software that you run. Seriously, software is narrating its life 24/7, right? It'll tell you that a user logged in, that a file was accessed, that a firewall rule was triggered, that the printer was jammed again. And while this is a gold mine of information, it's also a fire hose of data that takes up tons of space and can be mind-numbing to dig through manually. And so this is where SIEM tools like Splunk, IBM QRadar, Sumo Logic, and Logarithm come in. They act like superpowered librarians and detectives rolled into one. They centralize all these logs, they correlate events, and they spot patterns that other tools might miss, like weird login attempts across different systems that don't really seem suspicious alone, but they might raise eyebrows when you put it all together. So if your security systems are your guards and gates, think of SIEM as the CSI team piecing together clues and telling you when something fishy might be going down. Right? This is one of the areas, by the way, that AI is having a huge effect because these logs are essentially massive amounts of text in a structured format that's perfect for AI engines to process against. So expect to see a lot more interesting things coming out of this particular sector. So because we talked about logs, let's just spend a little bit of time defining what kinds of logs are out there that these SIEM tools will run on top of. You know, in the early days of computing, storage was so expensive that logs were kind of luxury. Look, we really had to say, do we really need to store that? But today we log everything. It's kind of the new normal. Every device, every app, every sneeze on the network is potentially logged. And the challenge, as we mentioned before, is reading those logs. And trust us, they are not written like bedtime stories. So for most network and security gear, routers, switches, firewalls, Linux servers, you'll run into the syslog format. It's kind of like the plain black coffee of logging. It's widely used, customizable, supported by just about every analysis tool out there. For web servers, they can get a bit fancier with a common log format or its fancier sibling, the extended log format. This is especially useful when you're debugging apps or you're chasing down weird browser errors. Meanwhile, Windows has always done its own thing, of course, splitting logs into system logs, security logs, and application log categories. So whether it's a blue screen of death, a security warning, or Word crashing for the 5th time, it's all recorded in the proper log. And again, which needs to be centralized and analyzed if you're looking for trends that may cross across your entire network or intrusions that may be coming in from different vectors, if you will. And at the bottom of this list, we've got tools like NetFlow and IPFix, which are the kind of the go-to logs for network traffic analysis. These are really deep dive logs, right? They're used by security teams when they're rolling up their sleeves to figure out what's really going wrong. And if you toss in some custom log formats from SIEM tools like ArcSight or QRadar, there is a huge universe of log languages to decode. So Bottom line is logs are the breadcrumbs for your network. And now that we save everything, and AI LLM models doing a great job of analyzing text, we're gonna see that these logs are much more useful and much more effective as time goes on. Not that they aren't now, but they're going to become even more effective. So if network access control is, hey, can I get to this network from where I'm coming from? Identity access management, or IAM, is all about who you are and what resources you're allowed to access, like apps, databases, file systems. This is the part of cybersecurity where you decide who gets access to what and how they prove that they belong there. So first up, we've got single sign-on, which is very popular today, which lets you use a single username and password to access multiple systems. So at Parker Gale, for example, logging into our Microsoft Active Directory 360 gives you access to email, SharePoint. It gives us access to our Ignite storage array, which is, again, provided by a third party. You name it. So yeah, it's the VIP wristband that gets you access to all the doors. Now, why you would do that, of course, with single sign-on is then it makes it really easy when a user moves on or somebody gets fired. You're making a change in one place that disables access to all of their systems. So there's a reason why it's both easier for users to have a single ID and a single password to log on to multiple systems, so they can use a complex password and don't have to have 10 different logins where they're using simple passwords because they can't remember them. Single sign-on is an important way to make these applications all connect together. Bunch of popular tools: Okta, Ping Identity, Microsoft Azure AD. Tied to that, at the next level down, is multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So this adds an extra layer of, are you really you? Where a single sign-on is basically a user ID and password to get access to multiple systems. MFA requires more than a username and password in order for you to get access to the resources you've been granted access to. This could be a text message, it could be an app prompt, it could be a code from your favorite authenticator app like Duo or Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, which we use at Parker Gale. Yep, we use that one at Parker Gale. And then the last category here is privileged access management, which is like your Fort Knox for passwords. So instead of sprinkling super user credentials across your source code, like digital glitter, please don't do that. PAM tools like CyberArk, Beyond Trust, Visodic, Amazon, AWS has their own as well. You store this data in a secure vault. That way software can use things like databases or file systems safely without having sensitive keys or passwords stored in code or in INI files where hackers can see them. In short, IAM is about making sure the right people have the right access at the right time without leaving the doors wide open. Now, as hackers have gotten more sophisticated, we have to get more sophisticated in terms of looking for problems and events. So next up, the Sherlock Holmes of cybersecurity is threat intelligence and detection platforms. So these platforms are constantly gathering clues from all over your environment. So they're getting real-time logs, real-time traffic, looking for weird user behavior, and trying to piece together a story before something goes boom. So you probably already noticed there's a little crossover between other categories of products here, from log managers to IP detection to threat detection. So again, many of these products are coming together. Many of the tools have multiple sub-products underneath them, but these are good enough broad categories of things you need to sort of protect against. So in this case, tools like Anomaly, Threat Connect, Recorded Future, they're going to roll up massive amounts of data to sniff out threats that maybe aren't on the most wanted list. So they're looking for sneaky unknowns or unusual patterns, both in real time and with the log data that might hit something's been compromised. You've got threat hunting tools which take a more proactive approach. So these would be your digital bloodhounds. Platforms like Elastic Security or Microsoft Defender XDR are constantly roaming behind the scenes, digging through telemetry data, alert you when something smells fishy. So, while your antivirus or endpoint detection maybe guard the front door, these are checking all the vents, the basement, the Wi-Fi router in the garage, just to make sure nothing has slipped through, right? So if there's a known threat, and all the security protocols and all the security vendors know about it, they can stop it before it gets inside. But as new threats happen, it may get in your organization before somebody even knows what it is. And these are the kind of tools that can help find these issues before they become a real problem. The last layer of defense, I guess, is going to be data security and encryption, right? So this is how you keep your secret. Whether your data is sitting peacefully on a hard drive, or flying through the internet tubes, in motion, it's going from a database server to a client browser application somewhere, or in memory inside an application. The goal is the same: keep the bad guys out. So tools like Veracrypt, BitLocker, Thales, they help encrypt data at rest. And most modern systems, Windows and Mac OS, even your phone, they can encrypt your disk right out of the box. So when data is not being used, it is encrypted. So simply pulling those files off your phone doesn't give people access to it. Paired with that, we've got data loss prevention tools would act like digital security at the exits. So making sure sensitive data isn't sneaking or leaking out of your organization disguised as a PowerPoint presentation or email attachment. So tools like Semantic DLP, Microsoft Purview, ForcePoint, that's their job. In fact, we owned one in a prior fund called Vericept that did exactly that. And if you don't need to share sensitive, or you don't want to share sensitive data, the last category of product here in under data security and encryption are tools like tokenization or masking tools. So they could replace things like social security number or employee ID information or patient data, patient's real address, patient's real name. They can keep it tucked away while sending anonymized data or masked data to partners as necessary. So the bottom line here is whether you're locking it up, you're trying to scramble to disguise it, protecting data at rest and in transit is mission critical. And it's important to do this. So you'll often see one of the requirements is that if you have laptops, they are encrypted. So if somebody gets access to the laptop and tries to just copy the data off, they're not going to be able to read that data because they won't have the encryption keys to decrypt it. Now, one that I'm pretty sure most people are familiar with is going to be web and email security. So also known as how to protect your two most popular digital doorways. So first up, let's talk about email. We've all seen the mountain of spam, phishing scams, malware that come down the pipe. Yeah, we don't want any of that stuff. And that's where secure email gateways like Proofpoint, Mimecast, or our old buddy Barracuda come in. These tools are your digital TSA agents. They're scanning traffic before it even reaches your email server in many cases. So filtering out the sketchy stuff, so only the emails that you want come through from people you know. And these get very sophisticated. You can even block to very specific countries or domains or IP addresses. So you can get pretty detailed here. The next layer beyond that is web application firewalls. So if secure email gateways protect your Microsoft Office 365, your Google Gmail, your AWS Workmail, whatever you're using for your email server, web application firewalls protect your websites or your web-based applications. So tools like the AWS WAF, Imperva, Cloudflare are very common go-to options. They stand between the internet and your servers. They block things like SQL injections. So this is trying to put data into fields that will run database commands on the back end. It's a very common way to hack systems in the old days. Denial of service attacks are a very common one here, like literally flooding your web server so that no legitimate requests can get processed or roll through. Most of these tools will perform geo-blocking, IP filtering. They can identify bots talking to your system. And then for the brave souls who need to visit sketchy corners of the internet, maybe for research or incident response, there are also browser isolation tools like Menlo Security, Authenticate Silo, or Ericom. So these tools give you a safe, quarantined way to explore without putting your own system in harm's way. So browser isolation separates the act of visiting a website from your local computer or server. It runs the browser in a secure, isolated environment, either in the cloud or a sandbox on your device, and then streams only the safe visual output, like pixels or sanitized HTML, to your screen. These tools are often used by security teams or network operators in your organization that need to investigate phishing sites, or employees that are accessing risky websites for research, or sometimes even in high-level industries such as finance, defense, and healthcare. So if you don't know where you're going, sometimes it makes sense to just use a browser isolation tool as your first pass before you dig into the details. So part of security and disaster recovery business continuity are often work hand in glove. So we'll talk about backup and disaster recovery just for a second, even though it's not purely connected to cybersecurity. Backup and recovery are the unsung heroes of your tech stack. Now, while they don't necessarily wear cybersecurity badge front and center, they absolutely belong in business continuity. After all, what is the point of protecting your network from hackers if a spilled coffee cup or a rogue update can wipe out your entire setup, right? Whether you're rolling with Veeam, Acronis, Rubrik, which by the way guarantees immutable backups with most of these tools, or some good old fashioned just copy and backups to S3 storage buckets, the goal is the same. Make sure you don't have to start from scratch if things go sideways. So if a hacker gets in, wipes out the configuration or router, deletes all the data on your server, you want to be able to restore yourself to where you were before that hacker got in. And it's important not to just think about your big databases and file systems, but all the little stuff. Server configuration scripts, router settings, or even data tucked away in apps. Back it all up. I promise you, it's totally worth it. Now, in a lot of cases, some of the script kind of stuff gets backed up into a source code repository like Git, but having a backup of it, just off the device itself is also good in case somebody's forgotten to take a snapshot or keep a copy of that script. So if you don't have enough expertise or don't have enough data, you can use disaster recovery as a service from folks like Zerto, Adado, or Carbonite. A lot of people who are Soho folks working out of their home office would use one of these services to back up right from their desktop or laptop to the cloud. So you've always got they work quietly in the background, so you've always got a full copy. These systems take snapshots, so you're able to restore to a point in time. They can make sure that the backups are immutable so that they cannot be changed. Therefore, if a hacker comes in and tries to do something with it, they can't. Most of these tools are smart enough to skip files that haven't changed, so they save time and storage space. They often have some very good compression algorithms. So while backup and recovery isn't glamorous, you're going to be glad that you have them. And this is an area that we see most portfolio companies have the weakest processes around backup and disaster recovery. They may be taking backups, but they're really testing that they actually worked. And then if we want to get a little nerdy, when we really need to investigate challenges, you're going to get down to DevSecOps and application security. So this is all about baking security right into your software from the first line of code, instead of just adding it on, after the software has been written like duct tape, right? So first up, we've got static and dynamic application security testing. So think of this as giving your code a full body scan before letting it out in public. Tools like Checkmarx or VeraCode or Fortify, they help sniff out vulnerabilities before hackers do. So they're looking for things like, overwriting memory addresses, passwords stored in files, things that make your software itself insecure before it even goes out the door. Married to those, and again, there's a lot of crossover between these products. There's security composition analysis, or SCA tools, which is like double checking all the ingredients before you cook your app. So tools like Sneak, or White Source, or Black Duck, or SEMA software. They're looking for risky open source components that you may have knowingly or unknowingly pulled into your build. So you may have used a JavaScript library that in turn pulled a JavaScript library, and that's where the either the licensing problem or the security problem occurs. And these tools will scan to that nth degree, pulling not only the stuff that you've included, but the stuff that your includes also included. Now, if you're also delivering your apps in containers, shout out to Docker's Kubernetes here, you may want to make sure that those containers aren't hiding anything nasty. So there are also tools like Aqua Security, Sysdig, Twistlock that will scan containers to make sure they're clean, secure, and behaving themselves before they go live. So because in the world of application development, an ounce of prevention is worth 1,000 patches. So as part of your CI/CD, as part of your standards developing code, building code process, it's really good to have static and dynamic application security testing and SCA tools as part of that standard build process. Believe me, it makes it much easier to support your software live in the world if you've done this work before just pushing it out into servers. Now, some of this can roll up into security standards or cybersecurity standards. So we'll take a quick detour here. These aren't security tools per se, but they set the rules of the road for how seriously your organization is taking its cybersecurity game. Sometimes companies adopt a standard because they want to. It's like choosing to eat healthy on your own. Other times it's mandatory that your partners or your customers are asking you to conform to a certain security standard, like being told you must eat your vegetables because the government says so. We're looking at you, healthcare and finance. Whether it's to meet those customer expectations, whether it's to win new business, or in some cases avoiding fines and finger wagging, the security frameworks help define what's good enough looks like in your market with your requirements and your customers. So while the standards themselves don't stop an attack, they sure do make sure that you're sort of set up properly to do what you need to do. So rather than just pulling things from the air, having a framework in place gives you a set of goals to map your security to, and it makes it much easier to explain your security posture to customers and partners or anybody else that needs to look at it. Apologies for the very small font, and I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of cybersecurity standards that keep companies out of trouble and keep your customers sleeping soundly at night, but we won't spend a lot of time on each of these. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit. One of the ones that almost everybody's familiar with is the ever popular SOC 2, Service Organization Control 2. Think of it as a full body scan for your company's data security, privacy, and operational integrity. It evaluates how well your systems are designed to protect customer data, and bonus, if those controls are actually working. Many of our portfolio companies go after SOC 2 certification because it's auditable, formal, and it's customer friendly. You don't get to just say you're secure. You prove it with annual audits, updated formal documentation, and real accountability. So this, handing a SOC 2 audit results to a customer usually makes them feel pretty comfortable. And this is an audited standard. So you are audited on an annual basis with SOC 2, and you'll have to share those results, or may potentially have to share those results on an annual basis. A third-party person is going to verify that you've done what you said you need to do with SOC 2. On the other side, there's things like NIST, the cybersecurity framework developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a friendly blueprint for building a security program built around 5 pillars: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, again, which you'll find maps to most of the security software we talked about in the previous section. They're just not telling you which ones to do. Unlike SOC 2, NIST isn't a certification. It's more like a maturity model or a playbook that can be adapted to suit the size and industry and complexity of your organization. So a lot of teams use this framework just to prep for internal audits or just to show customers that they take security seriously. Now, there are also a lot of specialized frameworks. For example, companies in manufacturing and critical infrastructure might be required to follow specific ISO standards like ISO IEC 27001. So that digs into information security management systems in a more detail. HIPAA, yes, everybody's favorite HIPAA, the healthcare world's rule book for protecting patient data. It's mandatory if you're dealing with anything remotely covered by protected health information. In other words, these frameworks are not just secure bureaucratic checkboxes. They're helping you to define and enforce the rules of the road for secure operations. So picking the right one or combination of frameworks to use, can help your company avoid breaches, build trust, even in some cases land new deals, because we're seeing a lot more customers of our portfolio companies asking for this information as part of a sale process. So whether it's, you need a flashy audit report as a sales tool, or you're just quietly tightening up by using an internal framework, standards help show the world that you're playing the cybersecurity game the right way. Now, we've talked about the network. We've talked about what kind of devices are on it, common security software, standards that you might be applying to. And in many cases, you're going to want to use third parties to help you with this, whether you outsource all of cybersecurity to a third party or you bring in contractors for individual pieces of this. You oftentimes are going to want to use MSSP services, particularly because these people are experts in their field. So, it's like I tend to say when you're buying a new car, negotiating with a car salesman is tough because they negotiate every day. You buy a new car once in a while. They do it for a living. Same thing with managed security professionals. This is what they do for a living. They often know more, and they're going to know more than the small team that you have, particularly at smaller portfolio companies. You're a Fortune 1000, you've probably got a fairly well fleshed out network and cybersecurity team. If you're a small company with less than 100 million in revenue, maybe not so much. So in this section, we're going to talk about managed security service providers. These are the sidekicks you can call in when you need a hand, or if you need to outsource the whole thing and you need a full team. Like I said, MSSPs are third-party experts who can help manage, monitor, design, optimize your security stack. So if you don't have a team of world-class cyber wizards in-house, it's a good idea to talk to a partner. Whether you're looking for somebody to keep an eye on your network, traffic 24/7, patching vulnerabilities in your devices before bad guys find them, implementing SOC 2, making sure your SOC 2 controls are actually working, a good MSSP can handle the heavy lifting. So think of them as your outsourced security command center. They keep you compliant, they keep you secure, and hopefully a little less stressed. Most of what they do are going to map to other pieces of software we've seen before. So let's start with basic network monitoring. When your network starts acting a little off, maybe it's dragging its feet, it's gotten a little slow, connections are getting dropped, you're getting some hardware failures. Typically, the MSSP is going to see that before you do. Okay, they could be watching from their network operations center or NOC. They could be watching 24/7 for anything that might signal a bigger issue looming on the horizon. So they might start to see lots of packets being dropped. So they're going to keep an eye on that because that may be an indication of something in your network or a device going down. You want to think of your MSSP as your neighborhood's network watch at this point in this role. So they're armed with incident detection. They have standard response skills when they find a problem. So whether they need to trigger a failover, they're going to reboot a cranky device, or changing configurations for you on the fly, they can sort of jump in to keep the network running, right? They're also your first line of defense against cyber attacks. So they can often cut off threats before they wreak havoc. So close your network at the front door, stop everything at the NAC level before anybody gets too far in your system, and they can start working on kicking them out, right? If something suspicious does show up in a corner that they don't manage, like your database server, they may be able to even just raise a flag by seeing network traffic, and they could send a ticket straight to the database team to deal with that. So beyond triage, they're also about long-term peace of mind. They can deliver root cause analysis. They can document lessons learned to prevent repeat disasters. And all of this is going to be powered by trusty monitoring agents. So you might hear terms like SNMP and NetComp thrown around, and driven by industry standard or popular NOC systems such as SolarWinds or Cisco DNA or Juniper Astra or OpenNMS or Manage Engine. Even in cases you could be doing a lot of this yourself, homegrown through Ansible. So at the very, very first level, they're monitoring latency, they're checking bandwidth, they're looking for jitter, they're looking for packet loss. They're going to be on the alert for outages, performance degradation, or hardware failures. So the two go hand in glove. Network performance having problems, can often be an indicator of a cybersecurity event. Now, once they've detected something that's a problem, the MSSP at the network management level, it's like your early warning system. They're looking for signs that something's going a little sideways, right? So sudden slowdown, an outage of some system, a piece of hardware throwing errors, filling up their logs. They're watching this and they're ready to act. So if they see that it's something that's just beyond the network level, they may be jumping in with an incident detection and response software. This may be running in the background and may have already picked up the problem. So at that point, they may reroute traffic, they may reboot devices, they may close off a machine, they may reconfigure settings. They're watching for cyber attacks at the edge or inside and blocking them at the door. And if something looks fishy but falls outside their turf, as I said, like a database, they can sound the alarm to the right team. So it's not just firefighting. The goal is to dig into root causes, document what went wrong, and suggest how to avoid a repeat performance. So the next time a similar problem happens or something misbehaves, the MSSP will be 2 steps ahead. So they've already solved that problem. They've got their clipboard answers ready to prevent this thing from happening again. Companies often use their MSSP to quarterback project management when there are breaches too. So including coordinating with law enforcement. So if you have been breached and there's a challenge, your internal team may be completely overwhelmed, you can use your MSSP or contract at that time with an MSSP to quarterback the project for you to remediate yourself back to where you need to be, kick the hackers out, fix the systems, report to law enforcement as necessary. Now, from a proactive standpoint, an MSSP doesn't just wait around for things to break. They could be actively tuning and tweaking your network, like your pit crew tunes a race car, right? They could be looking at trends. Is the storage growing faster than they expected? Is your network lagging, suddenly lagging from a new system coming online, or just from the number of users that are on the network? Are your log files suddenly ballooning out of control? So they can identify bottlenecks, they can fix misconfigurations, they can make sure your load balances are load balancing properly. It's not just about fixing problems, right? It's about preventing them, which is really important. They can help you prioritize the important stuff, like making your voice traffic, giving your voice traffic a higher boost than your data traffic, for example. They could be individually converting routers and network segments to add or take away speed or limit traffic. They could be optimizing your network for your Zoom calls, right? So, and if you've got service level agreements with customers, they're often keeping tabs on system performance to make sure that you're living up to those promises, right? The goal is your MSSP is assuring everything behind the scenes is running smoothly so your business looks like a well-oiled machine, right? Now, at the end of the day, they are your watchdog, right? So while your MSSP might be running your compliance and security monitoring operations, they're also keeping an eye out for anything that looks fishy. Things that maybe not caught in real time, a lot of disconnected events. So they may be looking at your security from a holistic view over the longer haul, right? So they may notice patterns of unauthorized logins, weird network behavior. The digital equivalent of something jiggling your doorknob at 2 a.m. They can plug directly into your SIEM platform and analyze logs across your network. They can partner with full-blown security operations centers for deep, long-term threat analysis. They're the guardians of your firewall, your access controls, your VPNs, making sure people only get into what they need, only when they need it, and properly get shown the door when they're done. On top of that, they may also be managing your compliance frameworks, whether it's SOC 2 or ISO or whatever other framework you're using. And they could be installing or choosing tools or help you choose tools that you need to make sure you're meeting those standards, right? So at the end of the day, they're trying to make sure that your cyber house is locked up tight, the lights are on, and it's moving as it needs to move. So one of the pieces to that on the longer haul is this idea of configuration management, right? So especially in complex networks, keeping things consistent, recoverable, and documented is key. The MSSP can act like your network's librarian, maintaining a detailed inventory of all your devices, complete with all the nerdy details, how old they are, whether they're still under warranty, what features they got, memory, disk, processor, network card, software versions of the operating system and layered software, including patches that they're running, right? And they're also keeping tabs on every change, be it a firmware upgrade to a network device like a router or a switch or a load balancer, a change to a setting, full-blown change out of all your routers for a refresh. They could be doing all those things, right? The best part is if they do it in an organized way, if something goes sideways after a change, your MSSP will have your back with backups and rollback strategies. So you want to be able to hit the digital undo button and get back to a working state rather than just saying, oops, right? So most modern organizations, they're trying to minimize downtime and they're trying to absolutely minimize mean time to recovery. And so a consistent backup of all your scripts, all your firmware, knowing what your entire inventory is of your network devices, machines is very important for me, able to both back it up, knowing how to reset it to what it needs to be to run your operations, and how to roll it back if we make a mistake in a change. Patch management is, let's just call it the unsung hero. The digital equivalent of regular oil changes. Whether it's your laptops, it's servers, routers, switches, someone's got to keep them up to date with the latest operating system, the latest firmware patches, and again, this is where your MSSP team can step in, making sure all your gear is supported by the vendors that you have. It's under warranty. It's running the most secure versions available. But it doesn't have to stop there, right? They can also play air traffic controller with other departments. So if your ERP team might be upgrading to a new version of SAP, or your CRM is getting a shiny new upgrade, security often needs to be looped in. Why? Because behind the scenes, you may need DNS changes. New network ports may need to be opened. There may be some additional TLC to keep things running smoothly and secure. So it's often important, even if your MSSP is keeping all your operating systems and devices all updated with the latest patches and updates, coordinating that with your other teams that may be running email or ERP or CRM is also super important, so you've got a holistic view. Your ISSP also may go outside your organization and talk to your ISP, so your internet service provider, the company that provides you with access to the internet and or your phone system, right? So let's face it, none of the fancy tech works if the internet access goes down from your sites, right? So your MSSP, can act like your middleman or peacemaker between you and your internet service provider. So your Comcast, your AT&T, your Verizon, your Level 5, all the usual suspects. They can be the ones keeping tabs on the circuits from your telco carriers that they're providing to you, so they can watch for outages. They can troubleshoot weird slowdowns. They can even step in to negotiate, SLAs. So either violations of an SLA or what the SLA needs to be with that carrier. So, if your Zoom call is freezing or your VPN, decides to go to lunch, the MSSP may be the one figuring out whether it's a hiccup in your building, that you've got a problem with the devices inside your organization, or the problem is from the outside on the digital highway. So either way, they're making sure that the bits and bytes stay in the move. And it's often really useful to have a third party like this staying on top of these external circuits, particularly because they're probably already monitoring similar circuits for lots of other customers. And oftentimes a breach at a large, or a blowout at a large, carrier center is going to affect multiple customers. So having some way to know that it's outside your organization is pretty important in order to keep things rolling. Now, we talked about, email is a huge category for most organizations. Everybody has email, and there's a lot of coordination, a lot of cybersecurity that goes on with email. Both DNS, so how the outside world finds the servers in your organization, because this is also pretty roped into email, and how email gets sent and delivered. So DNS is the phone book of the internet. I mean, for those of you who actually still understand what a phone book is. When you type in something like www.amazon.com, DNS is what figures out which actual server there in cyberspace should answer that call. So it points you to who owns, it translates that name to an address. It knows how to route to that address. It knows how to get you to those endpoints that will get you into that server or get you into that system. So, organizations often have dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of servers. This name to IP mapping becomes a bit of a puzzle. And so your MSSP is often the one that's keeping these pieces in place. On the email front, there are some very specific DNS records and information types to keep your email flowing smoothly, so you don't get any spammy surprises or malicious attachments or lost messages floating in the void. They are managing the all-important MX record issues. So this basically are the signposts that tells the world where to send your email. So for example, Parker Gale uses Squarespace for our website. www.parkergale.com goes to Squarespace, but email goes to Office 365. And so there's a different, email.parkergale.com server, and DNS and MX records determines where that email goes, what that server is, and how it gets processed. So it's very important getting under the covers and understanding this. Really make sure that you understand email deliverability issues before they sort of paralyze your whole organization, right? So, for example, Google to decide that you've suddenly become a spammer. So if one of your users sends like a lot of emails out at the same time, you could end up on their block list, which means your regular email addresses don't go out. So for example, if we happen to send 10,000 email messages from Parker Gale's domain to a bunch of independent Gmail users that we just bought a list, we may get our domain blocked. And so your MSSP can detect that it's been blocked, meaning that Gmail no longer accepts email from parkergale.com or any servers associated with it. So, having a good third party that understands cybersecurity, monitoring email and DNS is really important to keep your email and your servers flowing out there. We talked about this from a software standpoint, but this is one of the most overlooked jobs in IT, backup monitoring, right? Because what good's a good backup if it doesn't actually work when you need to restore it? So your MSSP is not just tossing files into a digital junk drawer. Ideally, they're making sure your backups are complete, they're intact, they're ready for rollback or recovery if necessary. That means regularly verifying backups, testing them like it's a fire drill, and watching for the usual suspects. A missed backup job, a corrupted backup, storage systems that are overly full. Maybe your system went log happy one day and the backup ran out of time. The MSSP is going to catch that glitch, flag it, and help figure out whether this is a, hey, we should drop it and fix it moment, or we can try again tomorrow kind of issue. So it's important to have somebody watching these backups, testing that they're valid, running table sessions to talk through what happens in the case of needing to do a restore or verifying a backup, because you don't want your data to vanish into the digital abyss. And last but not least, on our little set of services is twofold. One is help desk integration, tier one support. So in some setups, your MSSP isn't just watching the network. They actually may be picking up the phone for you when someone yells, hey, my internet's broken. Whether it's a frustrated employee who forgot the password or a customer can't connect, your MSSP might be handling tier one support. Although, fair warning, most companies don't use them for the little stuff unless they've got deep pockets, because they'll be pretty expensive. More commonly, your cybersecurity MSSP may step in as tier two support. So your internal team says, yeah, this smells like a network or intrusion issue. From there, the MSSP may pick up the ball. They become your digital detective, triaging weird system access, looking at the latency gremlins, making sure your telco hasn't wandered off with your security connection. They're often the first people to ask the golden question, have we checked the network? Have we checked the endpoints? And more often than not, that's exactly where the issue lives. So they may be acting as your tier 1-2 support, but they can be really good triages when you have latency, connectivity, or accessibility to server complaints. Now, they'll often roll this up into a overall package, if you will, the cherry on top, ongoing analysis and reporting. And so ideally, your MSSP isn't just fixing things and fighting cyber fires. They're also handing you some clear insights into how everything's running, from network uptime to whether your telco carriers and your ISPs are keeping their SLA promises. They can track ticket trends to see if your support needs are calming down or spiking. Are you heading into problems or coming away from problems? They can be flagging performance hiccups and even suggesting upgrades, like, hey, it might be time to trade in that sluggish 10 gig pipe for a sleek 100 gigabyte fiber line into your building. Ideally, they've got your back on capacity planning and budgeting. So routers, switches, firewalls, all these devices get old, they get cranky, and they eventually are out of warranty. So your MSSP can help you map out when it's time to replace them on a planned schedule, how to plan for depreciation, and how to justify bringing in shiny new boxes in next year's budget. In short, they could also provide the cyber sidekick analysis for today's problems and tomorrow's strategy. Right. So it's not a fire and forget. When you buy these devices, as we talked about, they need to be upgraded, but they go out of warranty. They may no longer be supported, and you may need to trade them out. So with all that, just wrapping up with some final thoughts. Security is not all that complicated. So there's 8 different categories you have to worry about. Lots of the products that you choose could be a suite. So one product may cover multiple areas. There are definitely third parties available to help you with a lot of these things, and we highly suggest you use a third party service, whether it's an MSSP or just an outsourced CISO or an occasional audit from a third-party term, because security is a difficult thing to master, and specialists in that field will know more about it or have forgotten more about it than you and I will ever know. So it's helpful to have them involved, but this at least gives you a primer of the things that you're going to want to look for in your systems and networks, and that you're going to want to ask your MSSPs whether they can provide you.